Welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast, where we celebrate the unsung heroes of the learning and development industry. As always, we'll be bringing some laughter and a bit of fun along the way, but more importantly, you'll get some incredible insights, key lessons, and unique perspectives on everything related and possibly unrelated to training and development. Let's get this show on the road. Welcome to the Impact Learning Visionaries podcast, and today I have with me Rory Sacks. Rory is a senior learning and development leader and a strategist with over 15 years of experience across multiple industries. His superhero talent is leaping tall buildings while guiding key decision makers in developing a culture of learning, anticipating and eliminating skills gaps, and facilitating the growth of new managers, executives, and the career development of all employees. Rory is the director of L&D at Komodo Health and the co-host of the podcast Is Training the Answer? Well, let's find out, shall we? Welcome to the podcast, Rory.
Oh, it looks like it froze. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
We're back.
Yeah.
We're back.
Yeah. Welcome, Rory.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Let's dive straight in. So you've had a long, illustrious career in learning and development. Do you want to kind of tell us a little bit about your background and some of the kind of highlights and I suppose the kind of the big outcomes in your career, things that you're proud of?
Yeah. So to answer the first part, like a lot of people in learning and development these days, I originally set out to be a teacher. So I have a master's degree in education, learned about all the formal educational foundations, methodologies, etc. And then after about 6 months of teaching, I left and I wanted to work in higher ed. And so I set out, I became an instructional designer. I worked for 2 higher education universities here in the States, and then set off on my path in corporate development, training, talent development, etc. Some things that, I'm really proud of in my career so far have been obviously leading the team at Komodo. We have a really great learning and development team. We've been developing some really incredible learning initiatives for our employees here. At Investopedia, I helped launch their Investopedia Academy. So it was a global training initiative on providing financial education to individuals across the globe. That was a really, really great experience as the lead education individual at that organization. And then some other programs here and there. That
Investopedia, but before we go into Komodo, I'm curious to unpack that Investopedia. That's quite a big challenge. Kind of finance is not an easy thing to understand, and especially investment finance. And as someone who has actively had to go with my tail between my legs and go to Investopedia to find what something actually meant before I made an ass of myself. Very curious to hear how you took on that challenge.
Yeah, it was a really great opportunity. So if you're not familiar with Investopedia is the leading information source for all things finance. A lot of college students use it. A lot of individuals use it mostly for definitions. I see this word. What does it mean? How do I apply it? Etc. And so they were looking for opportunities to grow. They are already in the education space tangentially, and they decided, let's provide financial training. And we set out to do that. My role in that was making sure that the subject matter expert was able to communicate in their brain to the end user to make sure that there were no trip ups, no hang ups, that anybody who took training or course could apply that knowledge in the market. So we had training on how to be a day trader. We had a great subject matter expert for that. We identified his kind of steps. We quantified it. We made it really easily and digestible. We created really engaging training on that, and then we pushed it out. And kind of the same, we repeated that methodology over a number of trainings.
And what I'm most fascinated about is how you manage to make things so easily understandable. Like, I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, to take like really complex concepts and be able to kind of articulate them in a way that's really easy for like Joe Average who's had no financial experience to understand, which is something that's always fascinated me, because half the challenge I think with people who come from my background, which is technology, is we often kind of use a lot of jargon and lingo and talk over people's heads, and it's taken me a long time to get out of that habit. But are there any kind of lessons or tools that you employed to kind of test when you were really kind of hitting that sweet spot of making things really easy to understand?
Yeah. So if you look at how children learn, it's chaos, right? They essentially learn by doing. And in some instances, that's really applicable. And if we're continuing to use Investopedia as an example, it's a little harder, right? Because the barrier to entry is money, and I may not have a lot of it, and I need to make sure that I learn enough so that I feel confident in trading. So taking the information and applying this kind of this learn by chaos methodology, we did the best to provide a safe space for training, as well as making sure that the information isn't filled with that lingo, right? People use that lingo. So, I mean, I could sit here and talk about Bloom's taxonomy and learning in the flow of work and all the buzzwords that everybody uses in learning and development, just like you could sit there and use buzzwords in the technology field. We use those buzzwords to make ourselves sound much smarter. But at the end of the day, there is common lexicon that people can use, and we really, really focused on that when it came to Investopedia, even at Komodo and any of the other organizations that I worked with, unless the audience was extremely targeted. So a converse example to that would be at Mount Sinai. I was working with physicians, working in the otolaryngology department, which most of us know as just your normal ENT, your ear, nose, and throat doctor. But the training that they were developing was targeted specifically to doctors, so it's okay to use that language. But once you kind of look at it as, do we need to use this word? And if we need to use it, how do we define it in a way that everybody can understand and know and apply that word in any of their application of what we're training them to do, then it's a win. I also think providing a glossary in your training is never a bad idea. So when we launched training through Investopedia, there were times, yes, where an instructor had to use a word or a phrase or whatever it is because it's global. We made sure that there was a definition, there's a glossary. So you can at any point kind of click on something, get a definition, and move on.
Brilliant. And I mean, that example you gave of Mount Sinai and the doctors was actually quite an interesting one, because I think as much as I think there's a lot of value in making things simple, we also, when we're in certain kind of areas of knowledge or bodies of knowledge, we start to develop these terms, these patterns and practices that there's so much meaning and context locked into one word that trying to re-explain that every single time is just inefficient. So I think it's an interesting balance to try and kind of solve is when do you use simple language versus when do you really kind of tap into those existing words that have so much more depth and meaning, and it's quite fascinating. So just then kind of jumping forward to Komodo, and by the way, I love the fact that you call people the Komodo dragons, because why not, right?
Of course.
What have some of your big challenges been, that you faced in that organization?
Yeah. So the challenges that we face at Komodo are very similar to, I would say, learning and development professionals across kind of any industry. First off, I think one of our biggest challenges that we have overcome was I was the first learning and development hire at Komodo. And so therefore, this was the first learning and development team. And a lot of that was building brand identity. And that is a very big struggle that a lot of organizations have, especially in learning and development, right? What is your brand? What do you offer your organization? Why should people come to you? Why should they take your training? All that is tied to your brand identity, right? So that's always a huge challenge. Another challenge is time. So I like to look at our biggest competitor from a learning and development standpoint as time. It's not meeting a sales goal. It's not anything other than our learners have a finite amount of time. How can we as a learning and development department make sure that our dragons are utilizing their time effectively to move the business forward in whatever capacity that may be? It may be, yes, getting on a sales call, a meeting going over 10 minutes, but it also is very likely that it could be going to a manager training for 30 or 40 minutes. It could be taking a quick micro-learning or e-learning within our learning management system on how to have difficult conversations before you go into a one-on-one where that conversation needs to be had. So those are our two biggest challenges, I would say. And we approach them, I would say, with data-driven analysis. We, on the learning and development team at Komodo, are constantly pulling reports. We're A/B testing, especially when it comes to branding, how we brand, how we communicate out, right? We A/B test, is email more effective? Is Slack more effective? How do we test that? Well, we track links, we track clicks, we track changing email titles, and we do a lot of testing to make sure that, again, our brand is appropriate and people know what we stand for, and that we are communicating to everybody that this is a useful way of managing your time, is to do some training.
And I mean, just for the I suppose the benefit of the people watching, I know Investopedia, your audience was, you know, the general public. At Komodo, just for context, are you now still training people in the general public, or are these internal people? Because I'm fascinated by kind of the terminology, almost describing it as customers and the way you're going about it.
Yeah. So to answer the question, yes, Investopedia was the world. It was everybody outside of our organization. At Komodo, at 1010 Data, at Persado, it was all internal employees. But we still use the language of customers because, from my perspective, we are providing a service to the organization, or we're providing a service to at Investopedia, our external customers. So that we still use the term customer. We also use the term dragon. But I think using the term customer from a learning development perspective helps frame a lot of what we do, right? If we just use, well, this is a learner, we don't always kind of take into the consideration all of the things that are required to engage a customer, which is selling, marketing, satisfaction. It's all those things. And so if we look at a learner or a dragon as a customer, it's all encompassing in our strategy.
So there's also something else you talked a lot about, which and the fascinating part is I think you've already kind of just tripping over my tongue. You've already kind of identified that, you know, the modern learning and development environment is almost like a mini business inside the organization. There's a lot of parallels between functions of a business and the new kind of almost expectation of what learning and development is. But the real one I wanted to start with is you use the word brand quite often when you were describing it. And I guess that's probably a term that's quite foreign to learning and development managers, is seeing what they do as a brand and creating kind of a brand around learning and development. I'd love to kind of unpack that a little bit and just kind of understand your approach to that. I mean, firstly and foremost, like, why a brand? And then, you know, kind of how do you build that brand, and why you essentially, or how are you seeing the benefits of that play out?
Yeah. So you had mentioned treating learning and development as a business. And this is something that my co-host John and I on our podcast is Training the Answer talk about a lot with every guest. This is something that we really like exploring and applying it in the sense that learning and development is a service to our business, right? We typically are not revenue generating. We're back office. We exist to provide organizational resiliency, making sure that the organization, no matter what kind of ups and downs hit, we are ready for them. And we do that by training people. And so looking at learning and development as providing that service as an internal component to the larger business helps, again, us put everything into perspective around what we do, how we serve the business, how we're going to succeed. So if we look at learning and development as you put it, a little mini business, well, we have a budget, we have goals, we have customers who are all of our learners. We have high use customers, which are teams that use our services very frequently. We have customers who don't. And so we need to develop a brand in order to meet our goals. We need to develop a brand so that people who are not highly engaged in our training see the value in it. And yes, there's word of mouth within the organization, there's emails that we send out, there's Slack messages, there's all sorts of communication. Our learning management system pings people, hey, you have a new training available. But all of those things are tertiary. At the end of the day, somebody's going to look at a giant list of names or departments in a hierarchy structure, and they're going to look at every department. If I can get them to look at L&D and see Rory, director, and know I'm going to go to Rory because this is what I need, then we've succeeded in developing our brand. People know why they come to us. Therefore, we never have scope creep. We don't have people asking us for things that are not within our purview. We have appropriately created our brand, and people know to come to us, and we can help our customers and meet them exactly where they are because they're not coming to us for anything that we don't do.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think that's it's really the way it should be done, right? I mean, it's a kind of a fascinating take, and the more I've delved into kind of speaking with kind of professionals in the learning and development space, the more, even though people haven't really hit the nail on the head, they're all kind of seeing that learning and development is starting to become this. Now, because you were, kind of like the first person on the ground building this kind of capability, this business within the business, so to speak. It's a lot, right? I mean, it's you're kind of almost stepping into being a mini CEO. And I think, for a lot of learning and development people, they probably think that's not what I signed up for. That sounds way too complicated, way too daunting. How would you kind of I suppose, just reassure people that that this is actually achievable, that it's and what are the types of skills that you think that people who are probably transitioning from the more traditional learning and development space into this new way of learning and development should start to be really kind of looking into and sharpening or honing their skills around?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It was a little daunting at first. To my benefit, that's kind of my bread and butter, is being the first learning and development hire within an organization, or kind of reformatting a department, if you will. For those out there who are also one of one, I mean, at Komodo, I've since grown the team. We are a team of 5, but it did at one point start out as a team of 1. For everybody else, there's a skill set that's absolutely needed, especially when you make the transition from individual contributor to more of a manager level role. And one of the detriments for sure is that it's not a big space, learning and development. And so you could, in theory, spend your entire career maybe never working with another learning and development person. And so that mentorship that a lot of other teams get to know what skills are necessary as you grow isn't there. And so a lot of it is trial by fire. But what I can say is, if you are a team of one, or you are an instructional designer or a learning and development specialist, and you do want to grow and kind of get into that more senior level role, the first thing I always do is go on a roadshow within the organization, talk to all the leaders, and create a vision. Your company has a vision. Your company has a mission. And if we're looking at learning and development as a business within a business, you too need a vision. You also need a mission. We have one at Komodo. Every learning and development team meeting kind of starts off with just me explaining, this is our vision. This is why we're here. This is why we exist within Komodo. And that helps be the North Star, whether we're a team of 5 or whether I'm a team of 1. That mission is part of the brand. And when requests come in, I can say, this is great. Like, thank you for the request, but this isn't helping us reach our mission. It's not as aligned to our vision as you may need. But the skills necessary are, strategy. Why do you exist? Again, the mission and vision may help with that, but well, how are you going to help the business, right? You are a business driver in learning and development. I think a lot of people shoehorn or pigeonhole learning and development into just manager training. If you can get your organization away from that to more of a performance consulting mindset around learning and development, you'll be much better set. You need to take the perception that you're a business driver. You're going to help everybody in the organization move the business forward. You're going to train the sales team on competitive intelligence or battle cards or how to close a deal. You're going to help the engineering team potentially use a new technology. You'll maybe outsource that training. You're going to help everybody within the org reach their goal. That is your goal. You're not just manager training. You're so much more than that.
Sure. So that example you gave right at the start, where you have your North Star, and I love that term, by the way. And how some people come to you and you will say, well, that's not within our vision, and it's not our North Star. That sounds like a really tough conversation to have with someone.
It is.
I mean, how have you kind of? Can you give us an example maybe of one of those tough conversations and how you've dealt with it?
Yeah. So we have a very prescriptive way at Komodo, and I've kind of built this over the years as to how training gets done. We operate very much on an IT ticketing system. So you have a request, right? I want to do this training. Great. I'm going to fill out this request. I'm going to answer all these questions. It's going to go to learning and development. And learning and development is going to look at that request. Typically, this is part of the analysis phase. Hopefully we've eliminated a tremendous amount of time by sitting down, having conversations, scope creep, all that whole thing. And we could take a look at that request. We look at our North Star. We look at everything, all the other trainings that are currently on our docket and our pipeline. And we look at each request not as how will training help solve this problem, but how can I, on the learning and development team, help this individual meet this challenge? And a lot of times, yes, people do say, I need a training, but training may not necessarily be what you need. You may need a one sheet. You may need new technology. And, a perfect example of this is at a company that I worked for, who will stay nameless in this particular instance, but they wanted a training on a very particular system. We need training. People don't know how to use it. Okay. Well, what is it that you want them to do? Because learning is all about behavior change. They're doing A. What are we trying to change their behavior to B? So they told us exactly what it is that they wanted training on. We sat on it. We reflected. We ended up going back, and I'm a firm believer in just putting all the cards on the table. And so we did. And yeah, it was tough probably for them to hear as well. But we said, look, you want a training. What we're hearing the challenge is this. We don't really believe that training is going to solve this challenge. You're better off just creating a quick one sheet of how to get from point A to point B within your system that people can access at any point, right? If you're going to put them through training, that's going to be time, it's going to be effort, you're going to have to track completions, you're going to have to do all this stuff. You just want people to do this new thing in this software. Great, just create a one sheet and be done with it. To your point, yeah, it was a little difficult. They wanted training, but we told them, let's track it and see what happens, right? We're happy to eat our words and admit that we were wrong, that training was the solution, but let's track it. On today, they are getting no help. As of tomorrow, we're going to provide them this new one sheet. Let's see how many requests we get about not being able to do X, Y, and Z. Follow the data, be data driven, and if the solution is reached, great. Then everybody's happy, nobody has to admit that they were wrong, and we can kind of all move forward, and you've provided a service to your customer that helps build your brand. You're now not only just an order taker, you're a business partner. People will come to us and seek advice.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting kind of take on it. Is almost you become consultants into the business, and of course, I'm guessing that really that requires you to understand the business around you and the processes and operations of the business pretty well in order to be able to do that level of quality kind of consulting.
Yeah.
Is that something that you feel that people should be doing when they start in new positions? Is kind of really spending that time to get to know the organization that they're working in really well and intimately?
Absolutely. If you are starting out as a maybe first time learning and development leader within your organization, as part of your roadshow, you should be asking what each business unit or department head, what are their goals? Just, hey, what are your goals? Do you have an OKR sheet? Would you mind sending it to me? You're going to provide the most value when you know what they're looking to do at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, and you can tailor your strategy to helping the business move forward so that when people do come to you, you know how the business operates, what the goals of the business unit are, right? If I know on commercial that their goal is to drive revenue by 50%, and somebody on commercial comes to me with a training request or help, I can say, how is this request going to help the commercial team as a whole reach that 50%? If it's not going to, hey, thank you for bringing this up. We can put this in our queue. Otherwise, yeah, great, we'll prioritize this. This is going to help the business.
Yeah, I think it's all fascinating stuff, and the data-driven side is I think such a powerful thing. It begs the question of what systems or processes you put in place to actually to gather data, because I can imagine a lot of people would probably look at this as a manually intensive task. Are there systems that you utilize to do this for you?
Yeah, so we have a learning management system. We have Tableau within our organization. We have Workday. We have the learning management system we use is called 360 Learning, which we really like. But at the end of the day, if you think about, again, your department as a business, technology, it's a bionic arm. It is not the end all be all. And that technology will and should change as the business becomes more complicated, as you're required to do more things and service more people. And so it's okay to start with a very low tech stack and say, look, this is just what we have. This is the data we're going to be able to provide to show success or failure in any one of our initiatives. If you, leadership, want more, great, then we're going to need more budget. But you're going to have to kind of cascade or scaffold that. Look, we're going to start here. This is a baseline. Let's start pulling data. Let's start figuring out what is important to us and what's not. Because otherwise, yeah, you can go out and you can get Docebo or Cornerstone and pay a tremendous amount of money for a learning management system and get all the bells and whistles and every single data point that you could ever imagine. But then you're going to be drowning in data. You're not going to know why you need it, what its purpose is. My recommendation is kind of always start small, have a couple of hypotheses, align it to your strategy, and see what systems your company already has, how you can leverage that, and then you can kind of always ask for more. So we didn't go out and get Tableau. The organization had it. We grew. We got to a point where we need more data and we need to connect more lines. So I want to know this from this person, which lives in this system, compared to their training, which lives in this system, and aligned with this other data point, which lives in this system. It became more sophisticated, but it didn't start out that way.
All right, let's take a very, very big departure, because I'm curious
Sure.
now to kind of tap into your brain and ask
Okay.
you, what are the things that really excite you about the future of learning and development? Like, what are the things coming up on the horizon which makes you feel like a kid in a candy store?
I would say that the one thing that I've seen in a very long time that has been truly interesting and applicable, because talk about AR, VR, and I have whether it's applicable has yet to be seen. I would say this concept and idea of learning in the flow of work, these concepts of these learning management systems kind of also being a little bit more flexible when it comes to what training is. So some are kind of taking on this, what's called LXP or learner experience, where it's pulling in information it's pulling in articles, it's pulling in videos from YouTube, it's pulling in content that isn't as prescriptive as a course. And I think there's a tremendous amount of potential there in terms of technology, and how we as individuals learn, which you're learning all the time. You listen to this podcast, you're learning. If you read an article, you're learning. You watch a documentary, you're learning. But that's not being captured for your organization to know that you're growing. These learning experience platforms and learning management systems that kind of take on that technology, I think will have a huge impact, especially as people stay remote and distributed across the world, on organizational growth and organizational resiliency. That is really, really exciting to me.
And are these, so having only kind of recently kind of come across this learning experience concept myself,
Mm-hmm.
and still being very new to it, is, how are you kind of sifting through all of this information? It almost becomes like a bit of a information governance type of role about what comes through, what doesn't. How are you dealing with that?
You're absolutely right. You do have to put governance policies in place. Hopefully, if the learning management system or the LXP that you're using has some sort of admin functionality where you can curate. So learning development can be a bit of a curation department as well as a delivery and development department. We listen. So if we share a podcast, We try and listen to it beforehand. Same thing with articles and books. We try and read them before we share it out, or it's maybe based on a recommendation within the organization. So I think that's a huge part of learning experience platforms that will add a tremendous amount of leverage and help in that governance. So if Jason, you and I are colleagues and you read an article, well, I'm more likely to potentially read that than finding something. Or if I know that the learning and development department has highlighted or pinned or recommends a podcast, I'm going to listen to that. And so it becomes kind of communal, but you definitely have to put in place some sort of governance policy. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess the question there is, I mean, do you see that type of service being top down, or do you see it kind of being democratized, where you kind of, you know, everybody's able to contribute, but within a set of rules of engagement?
I love the idea and concept of democratization around education. It was one of the big reasons why I went to go work in universities, and Investopedia providing kind of that level of information out to anybody who wanted it. But not a single thing happens in any organization, no matter how big or how small, without some sort of leadership buy-in, right? So if you get a leader, CEO or CPO or chief technology officer, or even somebody who just has a tremendous amount of informal authority within their organization that recommends something or is a catalyst to learning and development, you're going to see a much higher engagement rate. We always recommend our leadership team say something about a training, or mention that a training is happening, or take a training themselves, or share a book recommendation, or share an article. It has many levels of effect, right? It's leadership recommends this article, this course, this whatever to me. Okay. Leadership read it. Okay, I'm in. Like, my CEO read that book. I'm going to read that book. As far as the democratization part, that I would say is very important. It's a little harder without that leadership buy-in. But like all values, like all initiatives, leadership has to lead the way there.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I mean, I think there's so much more to talk about, but I think I'm going to kind of pose two final questions for you.
Sure.
The first is, and these are ones I always like to ask, because I always like to make sure that we offer little pearls or nuggets of wisdom to people watching this. So the first one is you know, if you were thinking back to, pardon the expression, little Rory as he started on this career that he embarked on, or any other new learning and development manager for that kind of point, is what's that one piece of advice, that one kind of nugget of wisdom that you would kind of share with them to say, I think this is super important?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot. One, telling my past self is to, one, definitely slow down, right? I think, especially in tech, we see a lot of other teams making rapid progress. Sales closed a deal, well, that only took a couple of weeks or maybe a month or two. You know, engineering pushed out a new product, the product team, like, people are constantly delivering on things. Learning growth, learning data takes time, right? People need to find it, digest it, apply it. It needs to be reiterated. It needs to become part of their life. And you may not necessarily see growth in 6 months. You may not see growth in a year. It's, you know, slow down, take your time, show consistent growth, be able to pivot, but don't expect to see massive leaps in only a couple of months, especially if you're the first learning and development hire, or if you just moved into a manager role or any of that. Like, it's okay to slow down and take your time. Again, you're building organizational resiliency, and that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, I think resiliency is such a great word to use there. So absolutely, completely resonate with that. Another R word. So, final question.
Yep.
In your kind of recent kind of last few weeks, months, has there been one book or podcast?
Yeah.
Besides, of course, this really, really incredible podcast called Is Training the Answer? But has there been a book or podcast that has really kind of had an impact or had an aha moment with you?
Yeah, so I do like to read, probably like a lot of people. I don't read as much as I should, as much as I want to, but I'm very interested in behavioral economics. So why people do what they do. I think it has a tremendous amount of applicability in learning and development as well. And the book that I'm currently in the middle of that I really like, it's called The Y-Axis, not Y, but WHY.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. By John List and Yuri Nizi. And it's really interesting. It's about the hidden motives of people and why people do what they do. They run all sorts of experiments, and books by them and Dan Arley. Anything about behavioral economics has a tremendous amount of application in learning and development, motivation. It helps with branding, getting your team motivated, getting your organization motivated. I highly recommend anything by Dan Arley or the book, The Y-Axis.
Brilliant. And as a huge fan of behavioral mechanics and economics myself, I couldn't agree with you more. Understanding why people do what they do and how to influence positive behavior change, I think sits at the heart of everything. So great book, go check it out, and thank you so much for being on the podcast, Rory. I felt that we could have done a huge deep dive into behavioral mechanics and how that influences learning and development, maybe in future sometime. But really, It's been lovely having you on, and thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
Brilliant. Hey, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Impact Learning Visionaries. If you found it interesting or helpful, please subscribe by clicking on the button down below so you don't miss our next one. Also, be sure to check out our Reality Bites blog for more information on how technology is aiding in learning development. Links are all in the description below. Go check it out. Thanks a lot. Bye.